I have the distinct honor of moderating a panel today with Dr. Rebecca Portnoff. She's the Vice President of Data Science at Thorn, but you already knew that. Dr. Portnoff, we're going to start off with foundations on the safety by design principles. Could you provide us an overview of the safety by design principles and how those safeguards can be embedded to mitigate misuse at scale?
Sure, happy to share, Sandra. And I think I'll start by setting a little bit of groundwork around some of the issue impact that we see from the misuse of generative AI, specifically in enabling sexual abuse and furthering sexual abuse of children. So just a bit of a content warning going into this. This can be a heavy topic, so please take care of yourself as you see fit. So when we talk about this issue, I tend to like to frame it across the way that it's impacting three core pillars of this type of work. The first is how it complicates victim identification, where you now see generative AI models used to scalably produce photorealistic AI-generated child sexual abuse material that can be difficult to distinguish from material that may depict a child that is in an active abuse scenario. We also talk about how it impacts re-victimization, where you are seeing offenders use existing child sexual abuse material to optimize or fine-tune broadly shared and open source generative AI models to hone them such that they are able to produce bespoke targeted content of those specific children, of those victims and survivors. And then finally, we talk about how it broadens the pool of potential and new victims, where you see things like deepfake sexual material being used to bully and harass minors, where you see this kind of material used to sexually extort minors. The list does unfortunately go on and on. The good news is that we still see a window of opportunity here to prevent these harms. So that is where the Safety by Design initiative came in. We started this work in the summer of 2023. We brought together several leading companies, including Microsoft, OpenAI, Meta, Google, all the big names you can think of, and then some smaller names as well that were critical in the ecosystem, where the goal was to bring together this cohort to have them collaboratively define, align on, and then commit to adopting a set of safety by design principles, where these principles, if enacted, will first reduce a model's capability to produce abuse material. So this goes all the way back to fundamentals of machine learning and AI, such as what's in your training data? Where are you sourcing this from? Do you have benign depictions of children in your data and adult sexual content? Do you have child sexual abuse material in your training data? Have you gone through the exercise of auditing, curating, and otherwise ensuring that you're responsibly sourcing this, like all the way back down to the fundamentals? The second goal of the principles is to make it such that that material that does still unfortunately get produced, as I know everybody in this space knows that offenders can be really, aggressive. they keep trying. And so what does it look like to ensure that the pipelines are still in place such that the material that does get produced is reliably detected, whether or not that looks like watermarking, so that you're able to reliably ascertain between material that is or is not AI generated, or having detection at the inputs and outputs of closed systems. There's a lot of things that can be done to ensure that those types of pathways are in place to minimize the production of this kind of abuse material. And then finally, what I think of as the maintain pillar, which is to ensure that we're minimizing the distribution of the underlying models and apps and services that are being used, and in some cases specifically built, as in with fine-tuning models on CSAM to produce this content. And so that can look like really simple interventions, like making sure that when somebody searches for nudifying app on insert search engine name here, that they don't get a nice, easy list of 25 sites to access. That can look like more complex barriers, like ensuring that you have scalable assessments of models that are being uploaded onto your model hosting platform in advance of them being hosted to assess them for CSAM capabilities or other types of abusive capabilities. So a lot of specific granular mitigations that came out from these three high-level ideas. But the goal, like I said, is to prevent the misuse of generative AI and furthering child sexual abuse. And it's been almost a year now, I think, since the initiative publicly launched last April, with all of these 11 companies at this point signing on.
And I know we've been tracking their adoption progress through progress reports, but I'd like to know what other work you're driving at Thorn to ensure that accountability for this safety by design initiative.
Yeah, happy to share that. I think at the end of the day, we knew going into this initiative that there will be companies that say that they're going to adopt these principles, and then they either don't or they don't do it fast enough to have impact. That there will be companies that come to the table and they do abide by their voluntary commitments, and then there will be companies that will never show up to the table at all. And so we wanted a strategy of accountability that properly addressed this broad spectrum of different stakeholders we might be engaging in, which led us to 3 different lines of work. So the first is the one that we've been collaborating with All Tech is Human on. It's the progress reports. So we field a survey with each of these companies, many of them on the annual cadence. So if you're looking for the scoop of what they've done, sorry, you will have to wait because it won't come out until later this year. But there's a couple of the companies who agreed to an every 3-month cadence where we are essentially tracking critical metrics like what % of your data sets have you curated in the way that you promised, and other sorts of progress and status to understand where the gaps are and also what they've accomplished. So if you're interested in seeing those reports, they're all available on Thorn's website. The second line of work has been around collaborating with standard-setting institutions. So this now gets into some of the, what does it look like to scale the impact of these? What does it look like to have these be valuable even for companies that are not necessarily going to come to the table for a voluntary commitment, but still have a desire to abide by industry best practices? So this has looked like work collaborating with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, to ensure that their existing planned work around establishing standards for preventing synthetic harms is informed by the efforts that we've been driving, and other similar efforts with computing institutions like IEEE, just essentially trying to open the door to that future possibility of having scientific standards that then unlock auditing. Essentially, that if you have a scientific standard, if you have an agreed upon consensus, there becomes a business incentive. You see this I have a computer security background originally, and you see this quite plainly in the computer security space, that you now have some incentive to get that stamp that says, yes, I am ISOC compliant. Yes, I am, this compliant. And so early stages, but that's the vision, is to start integrating into those kinds of existing systems. And then finally, informing policymakers. To help them understand both what is technically feasible and also what's impactful to prevent this kind of misuse, because again, there will always, unfortunately, be that element that doesn't abide by standards and doesn't abide by voluntary commitments and really needs some regulatory pressure in order to take action.
You mentioned companies that are checking in on a 3-month basis and giving you those quarterly progress reports. What progress is most encouraging in your eyes, and what gaps remain most urgent?
Yeah, so this is definitely a smaller sample because it's only 3 companies who did the quarterly cadence. So with that caveat, I will say I was really encouraged to see that the companies that are in that cohort that are building their own models have all successfully achieved that 100% mark for how often they, for their data set curation, that they report that they have reviewed every single piece of material to ensure that there is no CSAM, that they've followed that responsible curation element of it as well. So as far as excuse me, coming in from the fundamentals, that's really encouraging to see. For what gaps still exist, I talked a little bit about model assessment earlier as one of the avenues for having impact in this space. What it looks like to be able to conduct that scalably is still an open question, and it's one that really does need to be answered. Where you have new models, whether or not they are diffusion models or LLMs or whatever, whatever particular data modality they're in, we don't yet have mechanisms to scalably assess these at the rate at which they are being created and uploaded. And so you can have a good faith model hosting platform trying to keep up, but if they're allowing thousands and hundreds of thousands of models to be uploaded every day, well, you guys all know it's manually that's not going to be effective to assess that way. So that's a gap that I still see quite clearly.
And on the technical innovation side, we still see gaps to ensure the safety by design guidelines are positively adopted. What are you seeing in terms of generative AI? The most critical interventions are still needed.
So one of them is the one that I already mentioned, so I won't belabor that point, but there's a need for scalable model assessment. The other one that I'll highlight is we need better mechanisms to prevent adversarial fine-tuning of models downstream. So right now, if you have a model developer that's followed all of the best practices that we outlined and has released their model, unfortunately, all of that good work can still be undone if they open source that model and then an offender gets their hands on that model and fine-tunes it with some kind of abusive data. So there's nascent research that I've seen over the last couple of years coming out from academia that I'm really excited about that's focusing on this concept of what does it look like to make models more durable to this kind of adversarial downstream fine-tuning, but it is still early stages and not something that we're seeing effectively deployed at scale. And so that's definitely one. And then finally, this is, I would say, equal parts technical innovation and sort of platform policy, but we're really behind when it comes to nudifying apps and the ease to access them. It's still incredibly easy, and my colleague from research at Thorn is here. I wish I could remember the statistic exactly, but it's we know that the avenues that youth have, in particular, to access these kinds of nudifying models and services is just very easy. You search for it somewhere, you go on a Play Store, and that isn't necessary. There isn't really a technical reason why these types of harmful tools can be so easily surfaced, and it is something that needs to be addressed.
I want to move to AI and safety considerations. So there are several universally agreed upon principles and values regarding responsible AI. They include fairness, accountability, transparency, privacy, and safety. Beyond the safety, how do these principles show up for those involved in the Safety by Design Gen AI initiative?
Yeah, so I'll touch on transparency and accountability for today because I think they're both lodestones to the Safety by Design initiative. So when we talk about transparency, we of course have the progress reports. That's a key part of what we want to do here, and we consider it a way to drive accountability, to ensure that folks are aware of what is and is not happening. I think there's also the added benefit here of that comes from transparency with learning across the ecosystem, and that's definitely something that we want to see happen as a part of the progress reports, is not just what you did, but how you did it, to the extent that you can share without, releasing information that might make it more difficult for you to conduct that how. There's always a balance there, although security by obscurity is not a thing that you should rely on. But yeah, that piece of transparency as a vehicle for folks more broadly to be able to adopt best practices and to be able to iterate and learn and share that kind of mechanisms for impact, that's definitely core to what we're trying to accomplish here. And then when it comes to accountability, I know that typically with AI principles and accountability, the idea here is that you need a mechanism for accountability because the model can't be held accountable. If something goes wrong, there has to be a framework for accountability. I think that's all very valid and absolutely true. I personally would love to see us expand our sense of what it means to be accountable. And I don't mean that in the sense of I'm accountable for somebody else's bad behavior, but more to be cheesy with with great power comes great responsibility. What does it look like to think of accountability as what you have the opportunity to do? That if you have the opportunity to prevent, if you have the resources and the power to do that, I think to some extent, consider yourself accountable for that, and not in I'm going to shake a finger at you kind of way, but just as a collective responsibility. And I think that's another posture that we're really trying to encourage when it comes to this type of work. Is it's not just about what you're obligated to do, it's about what you can do, what's going to be helpful, and then to pursue that.
We've mentioned the power of multi-stakeholderism a few times today. What are the most impactful forms of cross-platform signal sharing that you've seen to date? And are there still technical or legal considerations that still impede that interoperability between platforms? And how has this particularly manifested itself in the era of Gen AI?
Well, I'd love to turn that conversation to turn that question to the audience at some point, because I feel like this group would definitely have some insight into, from your own experience, what's been valuable from a cross-platform sharing perspective. I'll say two examples that I'll highlight here. I don't know if we typically think of it as cross-platform sharing, but I do. If we think about NECMIC's hash list that comes from CyberTip reports, that to me is one of the best example of cross-platform information sharing that has had real impact when it comes to stopping re-victimization. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from both the success and the challenges to that program. And then I'll give a shout out to the Lantern initiative that's led by the Tech Coalition, which really speaks directly to this kind of the value that comes from being able to share those kinds of signals. As far as challenges, I know when I think about generative AI, that space in particular, data is gold, and so when it comes to, just to pick an example, if we think about what it could look like for the ecosystem to collaborate to create a training data resource that has already been reliably curated, that has already been ensured that it's been cleaned of abuse material, this would be a fantastic resource. This would now be a training data set that could be used by people who don't have as much, who don't have the same kind of access to either classifiers to use to clean these training data sets or the compute necessary to do it. Like this could be a big boost to allow for safe innovation. It would require people to give up a little bit of their gold to do that kind of thing, and I think that's a challenge. So.
Yeah, for sure. I would love to offer this last moment. Any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I guess I would just, last thought that I have is I'm thankful and encouraged to see that there are so many folks who show up and are invested, as David put it much more eloquently than I will be able to today, but who are seeking hope and are looking to build hope. That's something that's a real encouragement to me. So I hope that something that I said today brings you hope as far as knowing that there are difficult challenges that persist, but it is not an impossible problem. And if anybody tells you it's too complicated, it's too technical, it's not possible, please point them in my direction. And I would be happy to tell them, nope, in fact, it is not impossible. There is so much that can be done.
Dr. Rebecca Portnoff, thank you so much.